Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to ancient Egypt, where the scorching sun beats down relentlessly on mud brick homes and the air shimmers with heat over the desert sands. You can almost feel the sweat beading on your forehead as you step outside into temperatures that regularly climb above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Between the blazing sun and the arid desert winds, you'd probably last about half a day before collapsing from heat exhaustion if you tried to survive with your modern air conditioning habits. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop that in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself walking along the banks of the Nile around 3000 BCE. The heat is oppressive, seeming to press down on you from all sides like a heavy blanket. The sun is a merciless golden disk overhead, and there's not an air conditioner, electric fan, or even a bag of ice in sight. Yet somehow, the ancient Egyptians not only survived in this climate, they thrived, building one of history's most remarkable civilizations. The challenge they faced was not insignificant. In the summer months, daytime temperatures in Upper Egypt regularly exceed 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius. Even during winter, temperatures can reach into the 80s and 90s Fahrenheit. Add to this the fact that much of Egypt receives less than an inch of rainfall per year, and you're looking at conditions that would send most modern people scrambling for the nearest air-conditioned mall. But necessity is the mother of invention, and the Egyptians became masters at keeping cool through remarkably sophisticated passive cooling techniques. These weren't just random discoveries, but represented a deep understanding of thermodynamics that would make modern engineers nod in appreciation. What's fascinating is that the ancient Egyptians didn't separate their cooling strategies from the rest of their lives. Staying cool was integrated into every aspect of daily existence. From the moment they woke up to when they went to sleep, from the clothes they wore to the food they ate, from how they designed their homes to how they scheduled their days, everything took the relentless heat into account. Historians still argue about whether the Egyptian obsession with heat management was primarily religious, connected to their worship of the sun god Ra, or purely practical. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, with religious practices often reinforcing behaviors that had practical benefits for surviving in a challenging environment. Some of their techniques were surprisingly simple. Others were complex and required significant resources. Some were available only to the elite, while others were used by everyone from the lowliest peasant to the divine pharaoh himself. What they all shared was ingenuity. As you drift through ancient Egyptian streets in your mind's eye, you begin to notice details that escaped you at first. The narrow alleyways between buildings, the thickness of the walls, the strategic placement of windows high on the walls, the jars of water set in doorways. These weren't random architectural choices. They were all part of a sophisticated cooling system that predated mechanical air conditioning by thousands of years. The most remarkable thing about Egyptian cooling techniques is that many of them worked on multiple levels simultaneously. A garden wasn't just beautiful and productive, it was also a cooling system. Clothing wasn't just modest and fashionable, it was thermal regulation. Architecture wasn't just shelter, it was climate control. And before we dive deeper into these cooling methods, it's worth noting that many of these techniques were so effective that variations of them are still used today in eco-friendly, sustainable architecture. Sometimes the oldest solutions are the best ones, especially when they've been refined over thousands of years of trial and error. So as you lie there, perhaps with your own modern fan humming nearby, prepared to discover how people kept cool when the only power they had was human power. The only refrigerant was the water of the Nile. And the only thermostat was their own ingenious adaptability to one of the hottest environments on Earth. The Nile River wasn't just a waterway for the ancient Egyptians, it was life itself. As you stand on its banks, watching the blue waters flow past, you realize that this mighty river was perhaps the most essential cooling system in Egyptian society. In a land where the sun reigns supreme and rain is scarce, The Nile provided a precious resource for temperature regulation that touched every aspect of Egyptian life. The Nile's annual flood cycle, which ancient Egyptians called Akhet, transformed the desert into fertile farmland each year, but its cooling benefits extended far beyond agriculture. The flood typically began in June or July, precisely when temperatures reached their peak. This timing wasn't lost on the Egyptians, who saw it as a divine blessing, cool water arriving exactly when they needed it most. Walking along the riverbank, you notice how the air temperature drops noticeably as you approach the water. This isn't your imagination. Large bodies of water create their own microclimate, with temperatures often 5–10 degrees cooler than areas just a few hundred feet away. The ancient Egyptians understood this principle intuitively and took full advantage of it. Many wealthy Egyptians built their homes with direct access to the Nile or to canals connected to the river. Some homes even featured private docks where residents could easily dip into the refreshing waters during the hottest parts of the day. Imagine having your own natural swimming pool in your backyard during the scorching Egyptian summer now. That's luxury living by ancient standards. The Nile's cooling effect wasn't limited to direct contact either. The prevailing winds in Egypt typically blow from north to south following the course of the river. As these winds passed over the water's surface, they picked up moisture and carried it inland, creating a natural evaporative cooling effect for communities near the riverbanks. You might not have air conditioning, but those evening breezes coming off the Nile would feel divine after a hot day. For those who couldn't afford riverfront property, which was most people, public access to the Nile was essential. During the hottest months, it was common to see people of all social classes gathering by the river in the evenings to cool off. Children splashed in the shallows while adults soaked their feet or waded in deeper waters, finding relief from the day's heat. Of course, bathing in the Nile came with its own set of challenges, mainly in the form of creatures that might consider you a tasty snack. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of crocodiles in ancient times was as high as some sources suggest, or if the danger was somewhat exaggerated in recorded accounts. Either way, Egyptians developed a healthy respect for these reptilian river dwellers and learned to bathe in groups or in protected areas whenever possible. The Nile also provided an essential resource for indoor cooling, water for evaporative cooling systems. Large porous clay jars called zir were filled with water and placed in windows or doorways. As the water seeped through the clay and evaporated in the dry air, it cooled the surrounding area. It's the same principle used in modern swamp coolers, but the technology was perfected thousands of years ago by resourceful Egyptians. For the particularly wealthy, servants would collect water from the Nile in the cool, early morning hours and store it in stone containers throughout the home. The thermal mass of the stone kept the water cool throughout the day, providing a refreshing drink and a means to cool the body with damp cloths. Some containers were specifically designed with wide mouths to maximize evaporation, cooling both the water inside and the air around them. Beyond direct cooling applications, the Nile enabled the irrigation systems that supported lush gardens and courtyards, creating cool green spaces amidst the desert heat. You'll learn more about these living air conditioners later, but it's worth noting that none of them would have been possible without the Nile's regular delivery of fresh water. The river also facilitated trade, bringing materials from distant regions that helped Egyptians stay cool. Imported cedar from Lebanon was prized for its aromatic properties and was used to make cooling furniture. Metals and stones from Nubia and beyond were fashioned into vessels designed to keep water cool longer than local materials could. Perhaps most importantly, the Nile created a unified culture that allowed cooling innovations to spread throughout the kingdom. Techniques discovered in one region quickly made their way up and down the river's length, carried by traders, officials, and travelers. This knowledge sharing accelerated the development of cooling technologies and practices that might otherwise have remained local secrets. At night, as you lie on your rooftop to catch the evening breeze, you can hear the gentle lapping of the Nile against its banks. The sound is soothing, a reminder that even in the desert, water, the ultimate cooling resource, is never far away. The ancient Egyptians fell asleep to this same sound for thousands of years, grateful for the river that made life in the desert not just possible, but comfortable. Architecture in ancient Egypt wasn't just about creating impressive monuments to stand the test of time. It was a sophisticated response to the challenges of desert living. As you walk through the narrow streets of an ancient Egyptian town, you notice how different these buildings are from modern structures. Every aspect of their design seems purposeful, with cooling as a primary consideration. The first thing you observe is the thickness of the walls. Unlike the thin barriers of modern homes, Egyptian walls were massive, often several feet thick. These weren't just for structural support, but served as thermal batteries. During the day, the thick mud brick walls absorbed heat slowly, keeping interiors cool. At night, they gradually released that stored heat when temperatures dropped, creating a naturally regulated indoor climate. It's a simple but effective form of temperature control that modern sustainable architects are rediscovering today. The building material itself, mud brick, was an ingenious choice for desert conditions. Made from Nile mud mixed with straw and dried in the sun, these bricks had excellent insulating properties. The organic material in the bricks created tiny air pockets that reduced heat transfer, while the mud itself had high thermal mass. Unlike stone, which conducts heat rapidly, mud brick creates a significant delay between outdoor temperature changes and indoor effects. You might be sweating outside at noon, but inside a mud brick house, you'd still be enjoying the cool of the morning hours. Looking up, you notice another distinctive feature of Egyptian homes: their roofs. Flat roofs weren't just convenient spaces for sleeping during hot nights. They were designed to minimize sun exposure during the day. Many were covered with palm fronds or reed mats that provided shade while allowing hot air to escape. Some wealthier homes featured roof gardens with plants that provided additional cooling through transpiration, the plant equivalent of sweating. Windows in Egyptian homes were small and strategically placed high on the walls. This seemingly counterintuitive design actually created ideal conditions for air circulation. Hot air rises, so these high windows allowed it to escape while preserving the cooler air below. During the day, many windows would be covered with reed mats that could be dampened with water, creating a primitive evaporative cooling system when breeze passed through. The layout of Egyptian homes was perhaps their most brilliant cooling feature. Most were built around a central courtyard that functioned as a cooling shaft. As the sun heated the courtyard, warm air would rise, creating negative pressure that drew cooler air in through doorways and windows. This natural ventilation system, known as the chimney effect, kept air circulating even on still days. Some historians still argue about whether Egyptians consciously engineered this effect or if it evolved through trial and error, but the result was the same: a constant, natural airflow that made indoor spaces significantly cooler than outside. Doorways were another unexpectedly sophisticated element in Egyptian cooling design. Many homes featured indirect entries you couldn't see straight from the street into the house. These bent entrances prevented hot air and dust from blowing directly inside while still allowing for movement between spaces. It's a feature that's still common in traditional Middle Eastern architecture today. Color choices played a surprising role in Egyptian cooling strategies too. The exteriors of buildings were often whitewashed to reflect the sun's rays rather than absorb them. Interiors were typically painted in lighter colors as well, helping to maintain the feeling of coolness even during the hottest parts of the day. It's a simple psychological trick that actually works. Rooms with lighter colors genuinely feel cooler than identical spaces painted in darker tones. The homes of the wealthy took cooling architecture to another level entirely. Some featured elaborate air shafts known as malkafs, or wind catcher stall, chimney, like structures with openings facing the prevailing winds. These would capture passing breezes and funnel them down into the house, creating constant air movement. The most sophisticated versions had water features at the bottom of the shaft, so the air would be cooled by evaporation as it entered the living spaces. Imagine the luxury of having a constant cool breeze flowing through your home even on the hottest days, a truly remarkable feat in a time before mechanical cooling. Even the orientation of buildings was carefully considered. Many structures were aligned to minimize exposure to the harsh afternoon sun while maximizing exposure to cooling northerly winds. Urban planning reflected these concerns as well, with narrow streets creating shade and channeling breezes through residential areas. You'd notice that main streets often ran east to west, allowing buildings to shade each other during the hottest parts of the day. For all their cooling innovations, Egyptian buildings still had to contend with one unavoidable reality: dust. The desert wind carried fine particles that could infiltrate even the most carefully designed home. To combat this, many doorways featured a raised threshold, a small step that helped prevent dust-laden air from flowing directly inside. It's a minor detail, but one that made a significant difference in maintaining a comfortable indoor environment. As you continue your exploration of ancient Egyptian architecture, you can't help but be impressed by how these seemingly simple structures incorporated such sophisticated passive cooling techniques. Without modern technology, the Egyptians created comfortable living spaces in one of the world's most challenging climates, using nothing but careful design and a deep understanding of natural principles. Egyptian fashion wasn't just about looking good, it was a sophisticated system for staying cool. As you observe the people around you in ancient Egypt, their clothing choices might seem minimal by modern standards, but they represent thousands of years of adaptation to extreme heat. The garments themselves tell a story of practical ingenuity disguised as cultural tradition. The most iconic Egyptian garment was the simple linen sheath dress for women and the kilt-like shendite for men. These weren't just cultural identifiers, they were engineered for maximum cooling. The loose fit allowed air to circulate freely around the body, creating a microclimate between skin and fabric. This continuous airflow whisked away perspiration and prevented the clammy discomfort you'd experience in more fitted garments. Imagine wearing your lightest, loosest summer clothes, but even more minimal and perfectly adapted to the climate. Linen wasn't chosen randomly as the fabric of choice. It was the perfect textile for Egyptian conditions, and they cultivated and processed it with extraordinary skill. Made from the fibers of the flax plant, linen is significantly more absorbent than cotton, capable of soaking up to 20% of its weight in moisture before feeling damp. This meant that as you perspired, the linen would absorb the sweat and spread it across a larger surface area, enhancing evaporation and the resulting cooling effect. It's basically a high-performance technical fabric that predates modern athletic wear by millennia. The weaving techniques used for Egyptian garments were equally sophisticated. The finest royal linens were so thinly woven, they were nearly transparent, with thread counts that would impress even today's luxury bedding manufacturers. Historical records mention a linen so fine that an entire dress could be pulled through a finger ring. While that might be a touch of ancient hyperbole, archaeological samples confirm the extraordinary fineness of Egyptian textiles. These light, breathable fabrics maximize the evaporative cooling effect while providing the minimal socially required coverage. The color of Egyptian clothing was no accident either. Most garments were left in their natural off-white state, occasionally bleached to achieve a brighter white. This color choice maximized reflectivity, bouncing the sun's rays away from the body rather than absorbing them as darker colors would. Some historians still argue about whether this whiteness was primarily symbolic, representing purity and divine connection, or practical. The answer is likely both, with religious symbolism reinforcing a practice that had very real cooling benefits. Layering, a technique we associate with keeping warm, was cleverly adapted by Egyptians for cooling purposes. Multiple layers of ultra-thin linen created air pockets that insulated against heat, while still allowing moisture to escape. Wealthier Egyptians would often wear several layers of increasingly fine linen, with the highest quality fabric closest to the skin. This might seem counterintuitive, but these strategic layers could actually keep you cooler than wearing nothing at all when standing in direct sunlight. Headwear was perhaps the most important element of Egyptian cooling fashion. The head and neck are particularly sensitive to heat, containing numerous blood vessels close to the skin's surface. Covering these areas with appropriate materials could significantly impact overall body temperature. Common people typically wore simple linen headcloths, while the more affluent had access to elaborately pleated caps that increased surface area for evaporative cooling. The famous Nemes headdress worn by pharaohs, think of King Tut's iconic striped headcloth, protected the head and neck from sun exposure, while allowing airflow through its pleated structure. Perhaps the quirkiest fashion cooling technique was the use of cones worn on the head during special occasions and banquets. These cones were made of perfumed wax or animal fat mixed with myrrh, and would slowly melt during the event, releasing cooling liquid and pleasant scents as they did so. Imagine having a slowly melting ice cream cone on your head during a party, messy, perhaps, but undeniably cooling. Some Egyptologists questioned whether these cones were real or simply symbolic representations in art, but recent archaeological discoveries have confirmed their actual use. Talk about a hairstyling product with benefits. Children often went completely nude until puberty, a practical choice in the extreme heat that also conserved valuable linen. For adults, however, appropriate coverage was important despite the climate challenges. The compromise was achieved through strategic exposure keeping, covered what modesty required while leaving limbs bare for maximum cooling. Even in the hottest weather, maintaining proper appearance was essential, particularly for the upper classes. Accessories played their part in the cooling system as well. Handheld fans were common, made from feathers, palm fronds, or papyrus. The simple act of creating airflow across the skin enhances evaporative cooling dramatically. For those who could afford them, servants might continuously fan their masters during the hottest hours. One particularly luxurious version was the fan of ostrich feathers, its large surface area creating significant airflow with minimal effort. Jewelry wasn't just decorative but served cooling functions too. Wide collar necklaces left the neck a major heat dissipation zone exposed while providing shade for the upper chest. Metallic jewelry, especially gold, would feel cool against the skin when first put on and would conduct heat away from contact points. Some ceremonial items also incorporated cooling properties, like the metal menat necklace counterweights that could be positioned to press against pulse points. Even footwear was designed with heat in mind. Sandals made from papyrus or palm leaves elevated feet above hot ground surfaces while allowing air circulation around the feet. Walking barefoot on scorching desert sand would quickly lead to painful burns, but these lightweight, ventilated sandals provided protection without causing overheating. As you watch Egyptians go about their daily activities, you notice how differently they move compared to people in cooler climates. Movements are often measured and economical, minimizing exertion and the resulting body heat. Clothing enhances this energy conservation strategy, with loose garments that don't restrict movement but don't require constant adjustment either. It's a complete system: garments, accessories, and behavior, all working together to maintain comfort in extreme conditions. The daily rhythm of life in ancient Egypt followed a pattern that modern sleep researchers would wholeheartedly approve of, though it wasn't designed for optimal sleep cycles so much as for survival and punishing heat. As you experience a typical Egyptian day, you notice that the entire culture has structured itself around avoiding the worst of the midday sun. Dawn breaks early in Egypt, and with it, the population rises. By the time the first golden rays of sunlight touch the mud brick homes, people are already bustling about, beginning their workday while temperatures remain relatively cool. Farmers head to their fields, craftsmen to their workshops, and merchants to their stall, aiming to complete as much of their daily labor as possible before the sun climbs high in the sky. There's an energetic efficiency to the morning hours that feels purposeful and necessary. Around what we would consider mid-morning, around 10 a.m., you'd notice the first major meal of the day being consumed. This substantial breakfast provided energy for the morning's work and was timed to avoid cooking during the hottest part of the day. Imagine sitting down to a meal of bread, figs, and perhaps some fish from the Nile simple fare designed to sustain without requiring elaborate preparation that would generate additional heat in the home. As noon approaches, there's a noticeable shift in the energy of Egyptian settlements. The streets begin to empty, shops close their shutters, and a strange hush falls over areas that were bustling just hours before. This is the beginning of what we might recognize as the original siesta, though the Egyptians didn't use that term, of course. This midday rest period was a critical adaptation to the climate, not a cultural preference for laziness as some early European travelers mistakenly assumed. During these peak heat hours, typically from noon until about 3 or 4 p.m., most Egyptians would retreat indoors to the coolest parts of their homes. Activity would slow to a minimum as people conserved their energy and limited their exposure to the brutal midday sun. If you were to peek inside homes during this time, you might see people napping, engaging in quiet indoor tasks, or simply sitting still in the coolest available spot. Some historical records suggest that workers on major construction projects like the pyramids were given rest periods during these hours, a practice that historians still argue about, as some believe work continued regardless of the heat, while others maintain that even the Pharaohs' grand projects bent to the reality of the climate. This midday rest wasn't a luxury, but a survival mechanism. Working through the hottest hours would not only be unpleasant, but potentially fatal. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke would have been common dangers for anyone who ignored the natural rhythm dictated by the sun. By adapting their schedule to work with the climate rather than fighting against it, Egyptians were able to maintain productivity while protecting their health. As the worst of the heat passed and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, communities would come alive again. The second burst of daily activity would begin, with work resuming and social interactions increasing. Markets would reopen, children would emerge to play, and the business of life would continue until sunset. This evening, work period allowed Egyptians to complete tasks that couldn't be finished in the morning hours, balancing their productivity across the day's cooler periods. The evening meal, taken after the day's work was done, was often the largest and most social eating occasion. Families would gather to enjoy food that had been prepared during the cooler evening hours, perhaps dining outdoors to take advantage of dropping temperatures. Unlike the rushed morning meal, evening dining was more leisurely, providing a chance to recover from the day's heat and connect with family members. Off to sunset, activities would continue well into the evening hours. With artificial lighting provided by oil lamps, many tasks could be performed after dark. In fact, some specialized work that generated significant heat like metalworking or baking was often scheduled for nighttime to avoid adding to the daytime temperature burden. Imagine being a baker in ancient Egypt, firing up your ovens at midnight to bake the next day's bread before the sun could add its heat to your already sweltering workspace. Socializing, too, was primarily an evening activity. After the day's work was complete and temperatures had fallen to comfortable levels, people would gather in courtyards or on rooftops to enjoy the cooler air and each other's company. These evening gatherings strengthened community bonds while respecting the practical limitations imposed by the climate. Sleep patterns reflected these daily rhythms as well. During the hottest months, many Egyptians practiced segmented sleep, going to bed shortly after sunset, rising for a period of activity in the cooler middle of the night, then returning to sleep until dawn. This pattern, which might seem strange to our modern sensibilities, was perfectly adapted to the Egyptian climate. The nighttime waking period provided an opportunity for additional productive hours during the coolest part of the 24-hour cycle. Sleeping locations changed with the seasons too. During the hottest months, many Egyptians would sleep outdoors on roof terraces or in courtyards to take advantage of cooling night breezes. Some homes featured dedicated sleeping porches specifically designed to catch the prevailing winds while providing security and privacy. In cooler months, sleeping moved indoors to protect from occasional chilly nights. The entire Egyptian calendar was structured around these climate adaptations as well. The Egyptian year was divided into 3 seasons: Akhet, inundation; Pere, growing; and Shimu, harvest. Each season brought different temperature challenges and required adjustments to daily schedules. During Shemu, the hottest season, the midday rest period would extend longer, while during Peret, more work could be accomplished throughout the daylight hours. Religious observances and festivals were carefully timed to align with these natural rhythms. Major celebrations typically occurred during the more temperate seasons, while daily rituals were performed during the cooler hours of the day. Even the gods were believed to adjust their activities to the Egyptian climate, with certain deities associated with particular times of day or night. As you observe this carefully choreographed daily ballet, you realize that the siesta culture wasn't just about avoiding heat. It was an entire lifestyle designed to maximize human productivity and comfort within environmental constraints. By working with the climate rather than fighting against it, ancient Egyptians created a sustainable pattern of life that supported one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. Food and drink in ancient Egypt weren't just for sustenance, they were essential components of the cooling strategy. As you sample the refreshments available to ancient Egyptians, you discover an entire culinary tradition designed to lower body temperature and provide relief from the relentless heat. The most essential cooling substance was, of course, water. The Nile provided a relatively reliable source, though drinking it directly wasn't always the safest option. Instead, Egyptians developed sophisticated water storage systems that not only kept water available, but actually cooled it through evaporation. Clay vessels called amphorae was slightly porous, allowing tiny amounts of water to seep through and evaporate from the outer surface. This evaporation cooled the remaining water in exactly the same principle that modern desert travelers use with canvas water bags. The effect could reduce water temperature by as much as 15 degrees below ambient temperature. Imagine having cool water without refrigeration in 100-degree heat. Beer was another essential cooling beverage in ancient Egypt, though it differed substantially from modern varieties. Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and relatively low in alcohol content, more like a thin gruel than today's clear brews. It was consumed by everyone from peasants to pharaohs, often serving as partial payment for workers on major construction projects. The fermentation process made it safer to drink than water from many sources, while the relatively low alcohol content meant it hydrated rather than dehydrated the body. Some scholarly records suggest that certain brews were specifically created to be cooling, with additions like dates or herbs that were believed to reduce body heat. You might not recognize this cloudy, semi-solid beverage as beer, but after a morning working in the Egyptian sun, you'd certainly appreciate its refreshing qualities. Wine existed as well, though it was generally reserved for the elite and special occasions. Unlike beer, wine wasn't considered a cooling beverage. Its higher alcohol content could lead to dehydration. However, the wealthy had methods to chill their wine that would impress even modern sommeliers. Clay vessels of wine might be wrapped in wet cloths and placed in the path of the evening breeze, using evaporative cooling to chill the contents. Some elite households even had dedicated wine rooms built partially underground where temperatures remained naturally cooler. Historians still argue about whether some wine vessels found in tombs show evidence of being designed specifically to maintain cooler temperatures, or if their shapes were purely decorative. Fruit juices provided another cooling option, particularly those made from fruits with high water content. Watermelon, which has been cultivated in Egypt since at least 2000 BCE, was especially prized for its cooling properties. The juice was extracted and sometimes mixed with honey or herbs to create refreshing drinks. Pomegranates, grapes, and figs were also commonly used for juices, providing not just hydration, but also sugars and nutrients to replace those lost through sweating. Perhaps the most intriguing cooling beverage was a mixture called carcade, made from the dried sepals of the Hibiscus sabdariffa plant. This deep red drink, still popular in modern Egypt as hibiscus tea, was valued for its cooling properties. Modern science confirms what the ancient Egyptians knew intuitively: hibiscus can indeed lower body temperature and blood pressure. Served cold, it provided refreshment while also delivering vitamin C and minerals. The slightly tart flavor was particularly appreciated during hot weather when the appetite for heavy, rich foods diminishes. Dairy products played a surprising role in the Egyptian cooling diet as well. Though milk spoiled quickly in the heat, Egyptians produced various forms of cheese and yogurt-like fermented milk products that lasted longer and were believed to cool the body. These foods weren't just practical. They were associated with the goddess Hathor, often depicted as a cow, who represented nourishment and protection. Eating these cooling dairy products therefore connected Egyptians to divine protection from the harsh elements. The fruits that ancient Egyptians consumed were carefully selected for their cooling properties. Melons of all kinds were particularly valued, with their high water content providing hydration along with natural sugars. Cucumbers, technically a fruit, were cultivated specifically for their cooling effects and were often eaten at the beginning of meals. Dates, figs, and grapes provided quick energy while also contributing to hydration. Even the way fruit was served was designed to maximize cooling, often chilled in water before being presented at meals. Vegetables featured prominently in the cooling diet as well. Leafy greens like lettuce were associated with the god Min and symbolized coolness and regeneration. These were often dressed simply with oil and vinegar, creating a dish that would be recognized as a basic salad today. Onions and garlic, while pungent, were believed to protect against heat-related illnesses and were consumed in large quantities by all social classes. These beliefs weren't entirely superstition. Modern research shows that compounds in these vegetables can indeed help the body regulate temperature and protect against certain environmental stresses. The Egyptian approach to meat consumption was also influenced by climate considerations. Heavy meat dishes were less common in the hottest seasons, with lighter fish and poultry options preferred. Fish from the Nile, often salted or dried to preserve it, provided protein without the heating effect associated with red meat consumption. When meat was prepared during hot weather, it was often cooked with cooling herbs and spices like coriander and mint that were believed to counteract the heating properties of the meat itself. Cooking methods themselves were adapted to minimize additional heat in living spaces. Many homes had outdoor cooking areas or separate kitchen structures to keep heat-generating activities away from living quarters. Quick cooking methods were preferred during hot weather, with many dishes requiring minimal heat preparation. Some meals were prepared before dawn, when temperatures were lowest, and then consumed throughout the day. Even serving temperatures were carefully considered. Many dishes were served at room temperature or slightly cooled rather than hoda practice that continues in modern Middle Eastern cuisines. This not only avoided adding heat to the body, but also reduced the heat generated during food preparation. For the elite, elaborate cooling methods for food and drink were available. Servants might be sent to collect snow or ice from the distant mountains to the north, rushing it back to cool drinks for royal banquets. While this extreme luxury was available to very few, it demonstrates the lengths to which Egyptians would go to find relief from the heat. The combinations of foods were also important in the Egyptian cooling strategy. Meals were carefully balanced to include cooling and warming elements according to the season, creating a form of nutritional climate control. This approach, similar to concepts still found in traditional Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine, suggests a sophisticated understanding of how different foods affect the body's internal temperature. As you sample these ancient cooling refreshments, you realize that Egyptian cuisine wasn't just about taste or nutrition, it was a deliberate manipulation of body temperature through food. A form of edible climate control that helped make life in the desert not just survivable, but comfortable. Step into an ancient Egyptian garden and you'll immediately feel the temperature drop. These weren't just decorative spaces, but sophisticated cooling systems disguised as lush oases of greenery. As you wander through these living air conditioners, the contrast between the garden microclimate and the harsh desert just beyond the walls is striking. Gardens in ancient Egypt served multiple purposes. They were status symbols, food sources, and religious spaces, but their cooling function was perhaps most critical to daily comfort. The temperature difference between a well-designed garden and the surrounding environment could be as much as 10–15 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine stepping from a scorching 105-degree F street into a pleasant 90-degree F sanctuary, all without using a single watt of electricity. The secret to this natural cooling system lies in the process of transpiration. Plants continuously release water vapor through their leaves. Essentially, they sweat. This process cools the plant itself and, when multiplied across hundreds of plants in a confined space, significantly cools the surrounding air. A mature tree can transpire up to 100 gallons of water on a hot day, creating a cooling effect equivalent to several room-sized air conditioners running for hours. The ancient Egyptians didn't understand the science behind this phenomenon, but they certainly recognized and exploited the cooling effect of grouped vegetation. Garden design was carefully planned to maximize this cooling benefit. The layout typically featured a central pool or pond surrounded by concentric rings of vegetation. The water body provided evaporative cooling while also supporting aquatic plants like lotus and papyrus that added to the transpiration effect. Around this central feature, plants were arranged with taller species like date palms and sycamore figs, creating a shaded canopy under which shrubs and ground covers thrived. This multi-layered approach created a gradual transition from the hot, dry external environment to the cool, humid garden interior. The walls surrounding these gardens weren't just for privacy or security, they played a crucial role in the cooling system. Typically built of mud brick, these high walls blocked hot desert winds while trapping the cooler, humidified air produced by the plants inside. The walls also cast shadows across the garden space during different parts of the day, providing additional cooling through shade. Some garden walls were even built with niches specifically designed to create turbulence in passing breezes, forcing the air to circulate through the garden rather than passing directly over it. Water features were the heart of any Egyptian garden's cooling system. Beyond their aesthetic and symbolic value, pools and channels created a network of evaporative cooling throughout the space. The standard design included a rectangular pool large enough to reflect significant amounts of sunlight back into the sky rather than allowing it to be absorbed as heat. These pools were often stocked with fish that would eat mosquito larvae, solving the potential pest problem created by standing water. Around the pools, water channels radiated outward like spokes, carrying moisture to plants while creating additional evaporative surfaces. For the extremely wealthy, such as pharaohs and high officials, garden pools might feature fountains, not the elaborate mechanical systems we think of today, but simple spouts where servants would pour water, creating temporary spray effects for both cooling and aesthetic purposes. Imagine sitting beside such a pool while a servant creates a gentle fountain, the water droplets catching the light while cooling the surrounding ancient luxury at its finest. The plant selection for these cooling gardens was far from random. Egyptians favored species with high transpiration rates and those that provided maximum shade from minimum water input. Date palms were particularly valued for their combination of useful fruit, slender trunks that didn't take up much ground space, and broad fronds that created dappled shade. This filtered light was ideal for growing other plants beneath while still blocking the most intense solar radiation. Historians still argue about exactly which plant varieties were most common in ancient gardens, as artistic representations don't always provide botanical accuracy, but archaeological evidence from pollen and seed remains has identified dozens of species specifically cultivated for their cooling properties. Aromatic plants played a special role in these garden cooling systems. Species like jasmine, roses, and sacred blue lotus weren't just visually appealing, but released volatile oils that created a sensation of coolness when inhaled. These scented plants were often positioned near windows or seating areas where their psychological cooling effect could be maximized. Some garden layouts included raised beds of herbs and flowers specifically positioned to be at nose level when seated, creating zones of aromatic cooling where family members might gather during hot afternoons. Private homes weren't the only beneficiaries of garden cooling technology. Temples featured elaborate sacred gardens that cooled the spaces where priests worked and worshippers gathered. These religious gardens typically featured specific plants associated with the temple's deity, combining symbolic meaning with practical cooling effects. Palace gardens were the most elaborate of all, with some royal residences devoting more space to gardens than to buildings. These weren't just displays of wealth, but necessary cooling systems that made governance possible during the hottest months. The cooling effect of gardens extended beyond their boundaries as well. Strategically placed garden spaces could create air circulation patterns throughout an entire home or palace complex. Hot air rising from sun-baked courtyards would create convection currents, pulling cooler air from garden spaces through adjacent rooms. This passive ventilation system worked continuously throughout the day, requiring no energy input beyond the initial irrigation of the garden itself. Speaking of irrigation, the water management systems that supported these cooling gardens were engineering marvels in their own right. Water was typically delivered from the Nile or from wells via channels and shadoofs, a type of hand-operated crane for lifting water. The precious liquid was then distributed through the garden using a network of channels, often lined with clay to prevent seepage. Water flow was controlled using simple but effective mud plugs that could be removed to direct water to specific areas as needed. The irrigation schedule was carefully planned to maximize cooling effect during the hottest parts of the day, with many gardens receiving water in the late morning, so that peak evaporation would coincide with peak afternoon temperatures. These gardens weren't static installations, but dynamic systems that changed with the seasons. Plants might be moved in their containers to optimize shade patterns as the sun's position shifted throughout the year. Seasonal plantings ensured that maximum transpiration occurred during the hottest months. Even the water features might be adjusted seasonally, with pools being filled to different levels depending on the cooling needs of the moment. For those who couldn't afford elaborate private gardens, public green spaces provided some relief from the heat. Temple gardens were occasionally open to the general population during festivals, while some towns featured small public garden areas near wells or water sources. Even the humblest home might have a small courtyard with a few carefully tended plants in pots, creating a modest cooling effect that made a significant difference to indoor comfort. As you rest in the shade of a sycamore fig, listening to the gentle splash of water and breathing in the scent of blooming lotus flowers, you understand why Egyptians depicted paradise as a lush garden. These weren't just beautiful spaces, but life-supporting systems that made existence in the desert climate not just possible but pleasant. In creating these garden microclimates, ancient Egyptians demonstrated an intuitive understanding of thermodynamics and botany that modern sustainable designers are only now rediscovering. Night falls in ancient Egypt, bringing relief from the day's heat but introducing its own set of temperature management challenges. As darkness spreads across the land, you notice a remarkable transformation in how Egyptians use their homes and outdoor spaces. The nighttime cooling rituals were as carefully choreographed as any temple ceremony, designed to maximize comfort during sleeping hours and prepare for the heat of the coming day. The transition begins at sunset, as families emerge from homes where they've been sheltering during the late afternoon heat. Rooftops and courtyards that were abandoned during the scorching daylight hours now become the centers of activity. These spaces, which have been baking in the sun all day, radiate accumulated heat back into the night sky, a process that takes several hours. Egyptians understood this principle intuitively, waiting for the right moment to claim these outdoor areas for evening use. For wealthy households, servants would begin the cooling process by washing down outdoor surfaces with precious water. This evaporative cooling accelerated the temperature drop, making terraces and courtyards usable earlier in the evening. Imagine the luxury of having water-cooled floors beneath your feet as you enjoy the first comfortable outdoor moments after a sweltering day. Bedding arrangements underwent a complete transformation with the setting sun. Interior sleeping quarters used during cooler seasons were abandoned in favor of roof terraces or courtyards during the hottest months. Lightweight sleeping mats made of reeds or palm fronds replaced heavier bedding, allowing maximum air circulation around the body. These mats were often soaked in water and wrung out before use, providing additional evaporative cooling that could last for hours in the dry night air. The sleeping surfaces themselves were designed for thermal regulation. Instead of sleeping directly on the ground, which would retain heat from the day, many Egyptians used raised wooden frames that allowed air to circulate underneath. These weren't the plush mattresses we're accustomed to today, more like minimal platforms that elevated the body just enough to create airflow on all sides. For those who couldn't afford such furniture, simple palm rib beds raised a few inches off the ground served the same purpose. The management of nighttime garments was another refined aspect of Egyptian cooling strategy. During the hottest seasons, many chose to sleep in minimal clothing or nothing at all. Those who did wear sleeping garments opted for the lightest possible linen, often dampened slightly before wearing to create an evaporative cooling effect. Some high-status Egyptians had special nighttime attire made from the finest, most breathable linen available, luxury items specifically designed for comfortable sleep in challenging conditions. Even the position of the sleeping body was considered in the quest for nighttime comfort. Egyptians typically slept with limbs uncovered and splayed to maximize the surface area exposed to cooling night breezes. Historical evidence suggests they favored a position with one leg bent and one straight, a posture that increases exposed skin surface compared to sleeping curled up. Historians still argue about whether this position, frequently depicted in art, was primarily for cooling or had additional cultural or religious significance. Whatever the reason, it's remarkably effective for heat dissipation. Insect management represented a significant challenge for outdoor sleeping. Egypt's mosquitoes and flies could make sleep impossible without proper countermeasures. Wealthy Egyptians employed elaborate bed nets made of fine linen to keep insects at bay while still allowing air circulation. These were often treated with natural repellents like cedar oil or the smoke from burning certain herbs. Less affluent families relied on simpler methods like burning cattail fluff, which creates a mosquito-repelling smoke, or applying castor oil to exposed skin as an insect deterrent. The balance between airflow and insect protection was crucial. Too much netting would reduce cooling breezes, while too little would leave sleepers vulnerable to incessant biting. The timing of sleep itself was adjusted to deal with temperature challenges. During the hottest months, Egyptians often practiced what sleep researchers now call biphasic sleep, dividing their rest into two segments with a period of wakefulness in between. They might sleep from shortly after sunset until around midnight, then rise for a period of activity during the coolest hours of the night before returning to sleep until dawn. This pattern not only accommodated the temperature fluctuations, but allowed for productive use of the most comfortable hours of the 24-hour cycle. For the very wealthy, servants played a crucial role in nighttime cooling rituals. Palm frond fans operated by servants could provide continuous airflow throughout the night. Some elaborate households even employed shifts of fan bearers to ensure uninterrupted cooling for the master of the house. Imagine drifting off to sleep while being gently fed a luxury that required no technology but significant human resources. Other servants might be tasked with periodically dampening sleeping mats or operating larger palm fans that moved air through entire sleeping chambers. Water featured prominently in nighttime cooling strategies as well. Clay vessels of water would be placed near sleeping areas, not just for drinking during the night, but for their evaporative cooling effect on the surrounding air. Some sleeping platforms even incorporated space for water jars, positioning them where their cooling effect would be most beneficial to the sleeper. In the most elaborate homes, fountains or water features might be positioned to maximize nighttime cooling through a combination of sound and evaporation, the gentle splash of water both psychologically and physically cooling the sleeping environment. The pre-dawn hours saw another flurry of cooling-related activity. This was the time to prepare for the coming day's heat by storing coolness wherever possible. Water jars would be filled during these coolest hours and placed in shaded locations where they would maintain lower temperatures throughout the day. Home interiors were ventilated completely, allowing the cool night air to replace warmer air that had accumulated the previous day. Some homes even featured designated cooling room spaces specifically designed to capture and store the night's coolness for use during the following day. Children's sleep was managed with particular attention to temperature. Infants and young children, more vulnerable to heat stress, were often given the coolest sleeping locations available. Special ceramic vessels, similar to modern baby monitors, have been found perforated containers that allowed parents to check on children's perspiration levels during the night without disturbing their sleep. These simple devices could be touched to determine if a child was overheating or comfortable, allowing appropriate adjustments to bedding or positioning. As dawn approaches and you observe Egyptians preparing for another scorching day, you notice how the entire nighttime routine has served two purposes: maximizing comfort during sleeping hours and preparing people and spaces to withstand the coming heat. From the materials of the sleeping mats to the positioning of water jars, from the timing of sleep to the management of insects, every aspect of the Egyptian night was orchestrated to maintain comfort without any of the mechanical cooling technologies we take for granted today. When it comes to staying cool in ancient Egypt, all were not created equal. As you observe the cooling methods available to the elite classes, you notice a stark contrast with the options available to ordinary citizens. The wealthy enjoyed sophisticated cooling luxuries that seem almost magical in their effectiveness, despite the absence of modern technology. The pharaoh, considered divine and therefore deserving of divine comfort, had access to the most elaborate cooling systems imaginable in the ancient world. The royal palaces featured dedicated cooling room spaces designed from the ground up with temperature regulation as their primary purpose. These rooms typically had extra thick walls, sometimes up to 6 feet thick, creating a thermal barrier between the brutal outside heat and the carefully maintained interior environment. The floors were often made of stone, selected specifically for its cooling properties and sometimes carved with channels that could be filled with water for additional evaporative cooling. One particularly ingenious feature of royal cooling rooms was the serdaba sealed chamber built into the north wall that captured cooler air and channeled it into the interior spaces. These worked on the principle that the north-facing side of any structure receives the least direct sunlight in the northern hemisphere, maintaining lower temperatures throughout the day. Some royal serdabs were enhanced with porous water containers, creating a passive air conditioning system that could reduce room temperature by as much as 15 degrees compared to the outside air. Imagine having a room that maintained temperatures in the 80s while outside temperatures soared well above 100 degrees without using a single watt of electrical power. Perhaps the most extravagant cooling luxury available to the pharaoh was the corps of fan bearers. These weren't just servants with palm fronds. They were high-ranking officials with the title fan bearer on the right side of the king, a position of such importance that it appears in formal titles on tomb inscriptions. These elite attendants used ostrich feather fans mounted on long handles of precious wood, often decorated with gold and semi-precious stones. The fans themselves were engineering marvels, designed to maximize airflow while requiring minimal effort to operate. Some surviving examples show sophisticated pivot mechanisms that allowed the fan to be adjusted to different angles without the bearer changing position. The Pharaoh might be attended by multiple fan bearers at once, creating a continuous flow of cooling air even when completely stationary. For particularly important ceremonies or meetings, the Pharaoh might enjoy the ultimate cooling luxury, manufactured ice. Though extremely rare and difficult to produce in ancient Egypt, there is evidence suggesting that ice was occasionally created through evaporative cooling techniques. The process involved placing water in shallow, porous clay trays on elevated platforms during clear nights. As the water evaporated in the dry air, it would cool the remaining liquid, sometimes enough to form a thin layer of ice by morning if conditions were perfect. This precious commodity would be rushed to the palace, wrapped in insulating materials, and used to cool drinks, or simply placed near the pharaoh to cool the surrounding air. Historians still argue about how widespread this practice was, with some suggesting it was more legend than reality, while others point to specific technical descriptions in preserved texts. High officials and nobles, while not enjoying the divine status of the pharaoh, still had access to impressive cooling technologies. Many maintained country estates specifically designed for heat relief, typically built near bodies of water or in slightly higher elevations where temperatures were more moderate. These summer palaces often featured extensive gardens with cooling pools and shade structures, creating private microclimates where the elite could escape the worst of the summer heat. One particularly quirky cooling method favored by the elite was the use of human cooling proxies. Servants would be sent to swim in pools or rivers, and then, while still wet, would stand near their masters, effectively serving as human evaporative coolers. The water evaporating from their skin would cool the surrounding air, providing relief to those nearby without the master having to get wet themselves. It's a method that seems exploitative to modern sensibilities but reflected the profound class divisions of ancient Egyptian society. For indoor cooling, wealthy households employed what we might call wet nurses, though their role had nothing to do with childcare. These were servants tasked with continuously dampening wall hangings and floor coverings with scented water, creating evaporative cooling throughout private chambers. The rhythmic sound of water being sprinkled and the resulting fragrance created both physical and psychological cooling effects. Some elite households maintained shifts of these servants to ensure continuous cooling throughout the hottest hours. The wealthy also had access to specialized cooling furniture unavailable to commoners. Beds and chairs made of woven reeds allowed air circulation around the body, while some featured built-in basins that could be filled with water to cool the surrounding air. One particularly ingenious piece of elite furniture was the cooling chair, which featured a seat with a depression that could hold water-soaked cloths, cooling the sitter through direct contact and evaporation. These weren't just functional items, but status symbols, often decorated with precious materials and artistic motifs despite their practical purpose. Food and drink cooling reached extraordinary levels of sophistication for the elite. While ordinary Egyptians relied on porous clay containers to cool their water, the wealthy might have dedicated cooling rooms for their provisions, sometimes built partially underground where temperatures remained more stable. Some elite households employed servants whose sole job was to fan storage jars containing beer, wine, or water, accelerating evaporative cooling and ensuring beverages were served at the perfect temperature. Imagine having a staff member dedicated entirely to keeping your drinks cool, a luxury even many modern people don't enjoy. For outdoor activities, elite Egyptians developed portable cooling systems that allowed them to function in the heat while maintaining comfort. Large parasols held by servants provided shade, while portable fans created artificial breezes. Some highborn Egyptians even had portable cooling seats, lightweight chairs designed with water reservoirs in the armrests that could be filled with cool water, providing tactile cooling at the wrists, where blood vessels run close to the surface. The combination of these portable cooling technologies allowed the elite to remain active during hours when common people would necessarily retreat to whatever shade they could find. Even bathing became an elite cooling ritual far beyond what ordinary citizens could access. While common Egyptians might bathe in the Nile or canals, the wealthy constructed elaborate bathing pools in their homes, often designed with fountain features that would be operated by servants pouring water from decorative vessels. The elite might bathe multiple times daily during the hottest season, not just for cleanliness, but for temperature regulation. These baths often incorporated aromatic oils and essences believed to have cooling properties, turning a simple cooling measure into a luxurious sensory experience. The clothing available to the elite provided cooling advantages as well. While ordinary Egyptians wore simple linen garments, the wealthy had access to the finest. Most sheer linen fabrics, so fine, they were described as woven air. These ultra-lightweight textiles maximize the cooling effect of even the slightest breeze while providing the coverage required by social ever's. Verovilian by 5. Not. Tomplive ever over. Tomplive. Verovilian. Pomplive. Tomplive. Verolinen varian. Convention. Elite Egyptians could afford to maintain extensive wardrobes with garments appropriate for different times of day and weather conditions, changing clothes multiple times daily to maintain maximum comfort. Perhaps the most striking difference between elite and common cooling practices was access to space itself. Ordinary Egyptians lived in crowded conditions where body heat from multiple family members could make interiors uncomfortable despite the best passive cooling designs. The elite, by contrast, enjoyed spacious private quarters where each individual had access to optimal cooling features without competition. This simple spatial luxury, having room to spread out and avoid the accumulated body heat of others, may have been among the most significant cooling advantages available to the ancient Egyptian elite. Water wasn't just a life-giving necessity in ancient Egypt, it was the cornerstone of their cooling technology. As you observe the sophisticated water management systems developed by the Egyptians, you realize they were hydrological engineers of remarkable skill, using water not just for agriculture and drinking, but as their primary weapon against the desert heat. The foundation of Egyptian water cooling technology was the shaduf, a simple yet ingenious device that transformed water collection from backbreaking labor into a manageable task. Essentially, a counterweighted lever with a bucket attached to one end, the shaduf allowed a single person to lift water from the Nile or a canal up to field level with minimal effort. This efficiency made water more accessible for cooling purposes, as households could obtain larger quantities without exhausting themselves in the process. While primarily agricultural in purpose, the proliferation of shadufs meant more water was available for cooling applications in homes and gardens. For those who could afford them, more sophisticated water lifting devices emerged over time. The Archimedes screw, introduced during the Ptolemaic period, could move larger volumes of water with even less human effort. Though primarily used for irrigation, these devices enabled the creation of more elaborate water features in gardens and homes, enhancing cooling capacity. Some wealthy estates featured water lifting systems powered by oxen, capable of delivering continuous streams for fountains and pools without human labor. Imagine having a constant flow of fresh, cool water throughout your property in a land where water was precious, the ultimate luxury. Once water was obtained, storage became a crucial aspect of cooling technology. The Egyptians developed specialized vessels designed not just to hold water, but to cool it. The most common was the zir pot, a simple yet effective refrigeration device consisting of two clay pots, one inside the other, with wet sand filling the space between them. As water from the sand evaporated, it pulled heat from the inner pot, cooling its contents by as much as 20 degrees below ambient temperature. These natural refrigerators kept water, food, and beverages cool without ice or mechanical systems. Archaeologists have found evidence suggesting that some households maintain dozens of these cooling pots, creating what amounts to an ancient refrigeration system for the entire family. The material science behind these water vessels was surprisingly sophisticated. Egyptian potters experimented with different clay compositions and firing techniques to create vessels with specific porosity levels, allowing enough water to seep through for evaporative cooling without causing excessive water loss. Some cooling vessels featured textured outer surfaces, increasing the surface area available for evaporation and enhancing the cooling effect. The shapes were carefully designed as well, with wide mouths to facilitate heat escape and slightly pointed bottoms that could be embedded in cool, damp sand for additional temperature reduction. Water channels integrated into architectural designs serve dual purposes of irrigation and cooling. In elite homes and palaces, narrow channels might run along the perimeter of rooms or courtyards, cooling the air through evaporation while also watering plants that provided additional transpiration cooling. These channels were often lined with limestone or ceramic to prevent seepage and designed with slight gradients to maintain water flow without pumping. Some particularly elaborate systems featured raised channels that allowed water to cascade down in small waterfalls, increasing evaporation and creating pleasant acoustic effects at the same time. Fountain technology reached surprising levels of sophistication despite the absence of mechanical pumps. Utilizing the principles of gravity and atmospheric pressure, Egyptian engineers created fountains that could spray water upward without modern pumping equipment. These systems typically relied on elevated cisterns filled by human or animal power, with the water pressure determined by the height difference between the cistern and the fountain outlet. While not as spectacular as modern fountains, these water features created cooling mist and pleasant sounds that enhanced comfort in garden spaces. Historians still argue about the technical details of some fountain systems depicted in art, but never found intact. In archaeological sites, some scholars suggest they may have incorporated pneumatic principles that allowed for more impressive displays than simple gravity could provide. For cooling bodies of water like pools and ponds, the Egyptians developed circulation systems to prevent stagnation in the heat. Small channels connected to flowing irrigation canals would allow fresh water to enter pools, while equalizing outlets permitted excess water to exit, creating a slow but continuous circulation that kept pool water fresher and cooler than standing water would remain. Some elaborate systems included filtration beds of sand and charcoal that purified water as it entered private poolsa technology that anticipates modern pool filtration systems by thousands of years. Perhaps the most remarkable water cooling technology was the Nilometer structures built to measure the annual flood levels of the Nile, which also served as cooling chambers. These structures typically featured deep shafts extending below the water table, with stairways allowing access to various levels. The lower chambers maintained nearly constant temperatures year-round due to their depth and proximity to groundwater. During extreme heat, these spaces served as cool retreats for priests and officials. Some nilometers incorporated clever design features like aligned openings that created consistent air movement through the chambers, enhancing the cooling effect of the water below. Roof cooling systems represented another innovative use of water technology. Some buildings featured slightly concave roof areas that could hold a thin layer of water during the hottest days, providing evaporative cooling for the spaces below. These were typically found only in elite structures, as they required waterproof construction and regular maintenance. The water would be added in the morning and allowed to evaporate throughout the day, significantly reducing interior temperatures. It's a technique that has been rediscovered by some contemporary green architects looking for passive cooling solutions in hot climates. Personal cooling devices utilizing water were common across all social classes, though with varying levels of sophistication. The simplest was the water-soaked cloth, used to wipe the body or draped over shoulders to provide cooling through evaporation. More elaborate personal cooling devices included porous ceramic pendants that could be filled with water, worn around the neck, and cooled the wearer as the water slowly evaporated through the ceramic material. These ancient personal air conditioners were particularly popular among those who needed to remain active during hot periods, like soldiers and agricultural workers. Water was also integrated into sleeping environments for cooling purposes. Some beds featured ceramic holders at the head and foot that could be filled with water in the evening, providing evaporative cooling throughout the night. Wealthier households might position water basins beneath raised sleeping platforms, cooling the air around the sleeper. Some evidence suggests that fine mist sprays created by servants with specialized sprinkling devices were used in elite bed chambers to reduce temperatures before sleep. The management of humidity levels showed remarkable sophistication as well. While increased humidity can make heat feel more oppressive in already humid climates, in the dry desert air of Egypt, a slight increase in humidity actually improves comfort by preventing excessive moisture loss from the skin. Egyptian water features were designed to increase humidity to optimal levels without creating the kind of saturated air that would inhibit sweat evaporation. They achieved this balance by controlling the surface area of water exposed to air larger, still pools for more humidity, small, flowing channels for less. Even children's play incorporated water cooling technology. Clay toys have been found that combined play function with cooling properties. Dolls with small water reservoirs that kept cool for hours, balls made of porous materials that could be dampened before use, miniature boats that could be floated in cooling water channels. These dual-purpose toys allowed children to remain active even during hot periods while helping them manage their body temperature. As you observe these water technologies at work throughout Egyptian society, from the simplest dwelling to the most elaborate palace, you realize that the Egyptians didn't just use water. They developed an entire civilization around its cooling properties. Their hydro-cooling innovations created microenvironments of comfort in one of the world's most challenging climates, all without using a single watt of electrical power. The ancient Egyptians weren't just builders, they were material scientists who carefully selected and engineered substances specifically for their thermal properties. As you examine the various materials used in Egyptian construction and daily objects, you begin to appreciate the sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics that informed these choices long before the formal science existed. Stone was perhaps the most important material in the Egyptian cooling toolkit, but not just any stone would do. Different types were selected for specific purposes based on their thermal performance. Limestone, abundant throughout Egypt, was favored for general construction because of its relatively low thermal conductivity. This meant that heat transferred slowly through limestone walls, creating a significant delay between exterior temperature changes and their effect on interior spaces. A thick limestone wall might take 6-8 hours to transmit heat from outside to inside, effectively keeping interiors cool during the day and gradually releasing stored heat after sunset when temperatures dropped. For structures requiring even better insulation properties, sandstone was often selected. With more air pockets in its structure, sandstone provided superior insulation compared to denser stones. This made it particularly valuable for buildings where maintaining cool temperatures was essential, such as food storage facilities or certain types of workshops. The slightly rough texture of sandstone also created small surface shadows that reduced heat absorption from direct sunlight, a minor but meaningful advantage in the relentless Egyptian sun. At the opposite end of the thermal spectrum was granite, prized for its high thermal mass rather than insulation properties. Dense and able to absorb significant amounts of heat, granite was used strategically in locations where its temperature-stabilizing effects were beneficial. In some elite residences, granite features were incorporated into north-facing rooms where they would remain cool to the touch even on the hottest days, providing relief through direct contact. Some historians still argue about whether certain granite features in temples were selected primarily for their durability and prestige or for their cooling properties. The answer is likely both. Perhaps the most ingenious use of stone for cooling was the placement of large stone slabs as sleeping platforms in some elite homes. These would be positioned to avoid direct sun exposure during the day, maintaining relatively cool temperatures. At night, the stone provided a cooling surface for sleeping, drawing heat away from the body through direct conduction. Some of these sleeping platforms featured shallow channels carved into the surface that could hold small amounts of water, enhancing the cooling effect through evaporation without causing uncomfortable dampness. Metals played a limited but important role in Egyptian cooling technology. Despite the common association of metal with heat, think of a car hood on a summer day. Certain metallic objects were specifically designed to enhance cooling. Bronze mirrors, for example, weren't just for checking one's appearance, they could be positioned to reflect sunlight away from particular areas, creating small zones of shade where needed. Copper vessels were valued for their high thermal conductivity, which allowed them to rapidly transfer heat away from liquids they contained when placed in cooling environments. A warm beverage placed in a copper container and then set in the shade or in a pool of water would cool much faster than in a ceramic container. Gold, available only to the elite, had unique thermal properties that made it valuable beyond its status symbolism. Gold reflects infrared radiation, heat, more effectively than almost any other material, a property that made gold jewelry surprisingly practical in the desert heat despite its weight. A broad gold collar necklace would reflect body heat away from the chest and neck, creating a subtle cooling effect for the wearer. Some ceremonial gold face masks had practical cooling benefits as well, reflecting the heat of the sun rather than absorbing it as other materials would. Clay was perhaps the most versatile cooling material in the Egyptian repertoire, used in countless ways to manage heat. The composition of Egyptian clay items was carefully controlled, with different mixtures created for specific thermal purposes. For cooling vessels, Clays with higher sand content were preferred, creating more porous containers that enhanced evaporative cooling. For roof tiles intended to reflect sunlight, finer clays that could be smoothly finished and whitewashed were selected. Some specialized cooling vessels incorporated multiple clay types in a single object, with different porosities creating a controlled evaporation rate. The firing process for clay objects was equally sophisticated, with different temperatures used to create specific thermal properties. Low-fired ceramics remained more porous, making them excellent for cooling vessels, while high-fired ceramics with sealed surfaces were used where water retention was more important than cooling. Some cooling devices featured partially glazed surfaces, with the unglazed portions allowing evaporation while the glazed sections prevented excessive water loss, a remarkably nuanced approach to material engineering. Wood was relatively scarce in ancient Egypt, making its use more selective than in forest-rich civilizations. When wood was used in cooling applications, it was chosen with careful attention to its specific properties. Acacia wood, one of the more common native varieties, was frequently used for furniture because its density provided some cooling through conduction when in contact with the body. For elite items, imported cedar from Lebanon was highly prized not just for its pleasant aroma, but for its natural resistance to heat absorption. Cedar has a significantly lower thermal conductivity than many other woods, making it ideal for items like storage chests that needed to maintain cooler interior temperatures. Some of the most innovative cooling furniture combined wooden frames with woven seats of reed or palm fiber. These created breathable surfaces that prevented the heat buildup that would occur with solid materials, allowing air circulation around the body. The best examples featured slight elasticity in the woven sections, creating small air movements that enhanced cooling when the sitter shifted position. It's the same principle used in modern ergonomic mesh office chairs, but developed thousands of years earlier. Textiles for cooling went far beyond simple linen clothing. The Egyptians developed specialized fabrics for specific cooling applications, varying the thread count and weaving techniques to create materials with different thermal properties. The finest linens used for summer bedding were woven with high thread counts in a loose weave. The threads themselves were tightly spun, making them stronger and allowing for the spacious weave that maximized airflow while maintaining structural integrity. These summer textiles were often left unbleached, as the natural flax color absorbed less heat than brilliant white fabrics that had been treated with bleaching agents. For window coverings, specialized reed mats were developed that balanced the need for privacy, shade, and airflow. These were woven with variable density tighter weaves at eye level for privacy, looser weaves above to allow hot air to escape. The most sophisticated versions could be rolled up from the bottom in sections, allowing precise control over airflow and light levels throughout the day as the sun's position changed. Some mats incorporated aromatic grasses that would release pleasant scents when warmed by the sun, adding an olfactory cooling effect to their physical properties. Even the humble mud brick, the most common building material in ancient Egypt, was engineered for thermal performance. Unlike modern standardized bricks, Egyptian mud bricks varied in composition depending on their intended use. Bricks for exterior walls facing the harsh western sun contained more straw and chaff, increasing their insulation properties, while those for interior walls might contain more sand for better thermal mass. The size of bricks also varied strategically, with thicker bricks used for walls needing maximum insulation. The composition was so precisely controlled that archaeologists can often identify the intended purpose of ancient structures simply by analyzing the makeup of their bricks. The mortar used between bricks contributed to cooling performance as well. Rather than optimizing solely for structural strength, Egyptian builders created mortar mixtures that enhanced the thermal properties of their walls. Some mortar contained materials like crushed limestone or gypsum that improved insulation, while others incorporated organic materials that created small air pockets as they decayed, improving the wall's ability to buffer against external temperature changes. Plasters and wall coatings represented the final, crucial layer of material cooling technology. Exterior surfaces were typically finished with lime-based plasters that reflected sunlight, while interior plasters often contained materials like crushed shells that increased their ability to absorb and release moisture, helping to regulate humidity levels inside. Some specialized interior plasters found in elite homes contain gypsum, which has the unique property of absorbing heat when it releases its water of crystallization, effectively creating walls that actively cooled the air when temperatures rose above certain thresholds. As you run your hands across these various materials, the cool stone, the breathable textiles, the slightly damp clay, you appreciate how the Egyptians turned the very substance of their environment into a comprehensive cooling system, using material properties to create comfort in one of the world's most challenging climates. The ancient Egyptians didn't just manage their environment to stay cool, they managed their bodies directly through sophisticated bathing rituals, oils, and body treatments designed to regulate temperature. As you observe these personal cooling practices, you realize they represent a holistic approach to thermoregulation that treated the human body itself as an integral part of the cooling system. Bathing stood at the center of Egyptian cooling rituals, with practices that went far beyond simple cleanliness. While the Nile provided a natural bathing spot for many, dedicated bathing spaces existed in most homes, ranging from simple ceramic tubs in modest dwellings to elaborate bath chambers in elite residences. The frequency of bathing was remarkable by ancient standards. Many Egyptians bathed multiple times daily during the hottest months, understanding intuitively that wet skin in a dry climate creates a powerful evaporative cooling effect. Even laborers working in the fields would often take brief bathing breaks, dipping into canals or using water carried in skin bags to dampen their bodies before returning to work. The timing of these baths was carefully planned for maximum cooling effect. Many Egyptians took their most thorough bath in the late afternoon when temperatures peaked, then applied cooling oils that would continue the evaporative effect into the evening hours. Dawn baths were common as well, preparing the body for the day's heat by starting with thoroughly clean skin that could perspire efficiently. During particularly intense heat waves, brief splash baths might be taken throughout the day, using minimal water to create maximum cooling through strategic application to pulse points like wrists, neck, and temples. The water used for bathing was often enhanced with cooling herbs and minerals. Natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, similar to baking soda, was added to bathing water to create a mildly alkaline solution that cleansed the skin while leaving a thin, cooling mineral residue as the water evaporated. Mint, known for its cooling properties, was frequently added to bath water, creating both a physical cooling sensation and a psychological one through its refreshing scent. Crushed citrus fruits might be added as well, with their mild acidity helping to remove oils and perspiration residue that could block efficient sweating. For those who could afford it, milk baths represented the ultimate in cooling luxury. The fat content in milk created a moisturizing effect that prevented excessive drying of the skin, a common problem in the desert environment, while the liquid portion provided the usual evaporative cooling benefits. Cleopatra's famous milk baths weren't just a beauty treatment, but a sophisticated cooling technique that combined cleansing, moisturizing, and temperature regulation in a single indulgent ritual. Historians still argue about whether these elite milk baths used cow's milk or the more expensive donkey milk, with chemical analysis of residues from bathing vessels suggesting both were used, perhaps for different purposes or seasons. After bathing came the application of oils, perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Egyptian body cooling technology. Unlike modern thinking that associates oils with heat retention, the Egyptians understood that certain oils, when correctly applied to damp skin in a dry climate, actually enhance evaporative cooling while preventing the skin from drying out completely. The most common cooling oil was made from moringa, which created a light, non-greasy layer on the skin that allowed perspiration to pass through while slowing its complete evaporation, essentially extending the cooling effect of each drop of sweat. The composition of these body oils varied by season, with lighter formulations used during the hottest months. Summer oils often contained extracts from cooling plants like cucumber or aloe, adding their therapeutic properties to the physical cooling effect. Some oils were formulated to gradually release pleasant scents as the body warmed, creating a psychological cooling effect through aromatherapy principles. The containers for these oils were often cooling devices, themselves small alabaster jars that kept the contents cooler than ambient temperature through the stone's natural properties. Application techniques for cooling oils were precise and methodical. Rather than simply slathering oil across the body, Egyptians applied it in specific patterns that prioritized major blood vessels near the skin's surface. Extra attention was given to the sides of the neck, the inner wrists, the temples, and the inner ankle sole areas where blood vessels run close to the surface, and cooling can most effectively lower overall body temperature. For particularly intense heat, oil might be applied in layers, with each allowed to partially absorb before the next was added, creating a graduated cooling effect that could last for hours. Specialized cooling treatments were developed for different body parts. The head, particularly vulnerable to heat, might be treated with oils containing cooling clay that would harden slightly as it dried, creating a protective helmet-like layer that shielded the scalp from direct sun while allowing heat to escape. Feet, which contain numerous sweat glands, receive treatments with salt scrubs that remove dead skin cells and enhance the skin's ability to release moisture efficiently. Hands might be soaked in cooling herb infusions before work that required dexterity in hot conditions, temporarily reducing their temperature to improve comfort and functionality. Hair care incorporated cooling strategies as well. Rather than the heavy, solid wigs often depicted in popular culture, many Egyptian wigs were surprisingly lightweight and cooling, constructed with ventilation channels that allowed air to reach the scalp. For those who kept their natural hair, cooling masks made from clay, aloe, and herbs were applied regularly, both to maintain hair health in the harsh climate and to provide a cooling effect for the head. Some hair treatments included waxes that would melt slightly in the heat, releasing cooling essential oils throughout the day, an ancient version of time-released medication. Perspiration management represented another sophisticated aspect of Egyptian body cooling technology. Unlike cultures that viewed sweat negatively, Egyptians understood its essential cooling function and developed techniques to optimize rather than suppress it. Light exfoliation with natron salt or fine sand removed dead skin cells that could block sweat glands, while certain herbal preparations were used to stimulate perspiration in areas with fewer natural sweat glands. The goal wasn't to prevent sweating, but to make it more efficient, producing the maximum cooling effect from the minimum moisture loss, crucial in a desert environment where water conservation was always a concern. Clothing maintenance was integrated into these body cooling systems. Garments were regularly treated with aromatic preparations that would release cooling scents when activated by body heat or perspiration. Some treatments included mild antiseptic properties that prevented the bacterial growth that can make sweaty clothing uncomfortable. Linen garments were carefully laundered using natron, which left a slight mineral residue that enhanced the fabric's cooling properties, making each washing not just a cleaning process, but a renewal of the garment's temperature-regulating capabilities. For the eyes, particularly vulnerable to the intense Egyptian sunlight, cooling compresses were regularly applied. These might consist of cucumber slices, cloth soaked in herb-infused water, or small ceramic eye cups filled with cooling liquids. Beyond treating existing eye strain, these therapies were used preventatively, reducing the blood vessel dilation that occurs with heat exposure and minimizing the risk of headaches and vision disturbances during extreme temperature events. Even sleeping preparations included body cooling elements. Before retiring for the night, many Egyptians would apply a final layer of cooling oils specifically formulated to work gradually throughout the sleeping hours. Sleep surfaces might be misted with water infused with sedative herbs, creating a cooling microclimate that enhanced both comfort and sleep quality. Some elite Egyptians slept with small, specially shaped alabaster or ceramic pieces placed at pulse points, these cool stones gradually drawing heat from the body throughout the sleeping hours. The Egyptian approach to body cooling also extended to internal regulation through breath control. Certain breathing techniques were taught that maximized the cooling effect of respiration. By inhaling slowly through the nose and exhaling through slightly pursed lips, the evaporative cooling effect in the mouth and throat could be enhanced. These techniques, possibly associated with spiritual practices, had very real physiological cooling effects that supplemented the external cooling methods applied to the skin. As you observe these diverse bodily cooling practices, from elaborate bathing rituals to precisely applied oils to specialized breathing techniques, you recognize that the Egyptians viewed the human body not just as something to be protected from the heat, but as an active participant in their cooling technology, a sophisticated system that could be optimized through careful maintenance and strategic interventions. The ancient Egyptian calendar recognized 3 distinct seasons rather than 4, each presenting unique temperature management challenges. As you experience these seasonal shifts, you notice how cooling strategies evolved throughout the year, adapting to the changing conditions with remarkable precision. The Egyptians didn't have a single approach to cooling, but a sophisticated repertoire of techniques deployed strategically as the year progressed. Akhet, the inundation season from roughly June to October, presented perhaps the most complex cooling challenge. During this period, the annual Nile flood brought life-giving water to the fields, but also increased humidity levels along the river valley. While the flooding provided natural cooling through expanded water surfaces, the increased moisture in the air reduced the effectiveness of evaporative cooling techniques that worked well in drier conditions. Imagine trying to stay comfortable in weather that combines high temperatures with moderate humidity, not quite as oppressive as a tropical climate, but certainly more challenging than dry desert heat. During Akhet, Egyptians adjusted their cooling strategies to account for these conditions. Clothing became even lighter, with the finest, most open-weave linens preferred to maximize air circulation against the skin. Bathing frequency increased, with emphasis on thorough drying afterward to remove excess moisture from the skin, allowing more efficient perspiration. Indoor activities shifted to slightly different spaces than those used during the dry season, with preference given to rooms with cross-ventilation rather than those designed primarily for evaporative cooling. Garden maintenance shifted during Akhet as well. With natural moisture more abundant, less irrigation was required, but more pruning was undertaken to ensure maximum air circulation through vegetation. Some plants that thrive during the drier seasons might be temporarily replaced with species better adapted to higher humidity levels and still providing good transpiration cooling. The focus shifted from creating moisture to managing it effectively, ensuring that the beneficial cooling aspects of humidity were maximized while the uncomfortable stickiness was minimized. Architectural features designed specifically for Akhet came into play during these months. Some homes featured seasonal rooms that were only used during the inundation period, typically positioned to catch cross breezes and built with wider openings than those used during drier seasons. Sleeping might shift from rooftops, now too humid for comfort, to elevated platforms inside these specially designed spaces, often positioned near windows oriented to catch the prevailing north winds. Roof vents might be adjusted to increase air exchange rates, removing humid air that accumulated during the day. Even cooking practices adapted during Akhet. With evaporative cooling less effective, adding moisture to the air through cooking became more problematic. Many households shifted to food preparation methods that produced less steam, favoring quick grilling or items that could be eaten with minimal heating. The timing of cooking shifted as well, with more food prepared during the relatively cooler early morning hours than consumed throughout the day without additional heating that would increase indoor humidity. Porous, the growing season from approximately October to February, represented the most comfortable period in the Egyptian year. Temperatures were moderate, humidity levels dropped, and the recently irrigated fields provided extensive evaporative cooling without creating excessive moisture in the air. During this season, many specialized cooling techniques could be relaxed, though the Egyptians remained vigilant against occasional heat spikes that could occur even during these relatively pleasant months. The focus during Porous shifted somewhat from active cooling to heat retention for the cooler nights. Homes that had been opened completely for maximum airflow during hotter seasons might now have certain doorways covered during the evening hours to retain the warmth absorbed by thermal mass elements during the day. Sleeping arrangements typically moved indoors, with slightly heavier linens used as bedding. The roof sleeping platforms so essential during hotter periods were largely abandoned during Porous nights when temperatures could drop significantly after sunset. Clothing during Porous became slightly heavier, with more layers used particularly during morning and evening hours. These additional layers could be removed during the warmest part of the day, then replaced as temperatures fell. This adaptive clothing strategy allowed Egyptians to remain comfortable throughout the day without needing to return home to change. Some garments were specifically designed for this transitional season, with adjustable features like foldable sleeves or detachable overlayers that could be reconfigured as conditions change throughout the day. Water features that had been crucial for cooling during hotter seasons took on different roles during Parae. Pools and channels that previously served primarily as evaporative cooling surfaces now functioned more as thermal mass, absorbing the sun's warmth during the day and releasing it slowly during the cooler nights. Some garden pools might be partially drained during this season, reducing their cooling effect while still supporting essential plants and providing emergency water reserves if the typically dry Parae received less rainfall than usual. Shemu, the harvest and drought season from roughly February to June, presented the most intense heat management challenge. With the Nile at its lowest, humidity levels dropped to minimal levels, creating classic desert conditions of extreme heat combined with very dry air. While the low humidity enhanced the effectiveness of evaporative cooling techniques, the sheer intensity of the heat required deployment of every cooling strategy in the Egyptian repertoire. Imagine facing day after day of temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Celsius, 38 degrees Celsius, with no mechanical cooling. This was the reality Egyptians navigated annually during Shemu. During this season, water conservation became intimately linked with cooling strategies. With the Nile low and no rain expected, every drop needed to serve multiple purposes. Water used for cooling was carefully captured and reused whenever possible. Water that cooled drinking vessels might later irrigate small herb gardens, which would then provide both food and cooling transpiration. Some households maintained seasonal water budgets, carefully allocating their resources between essential drinking needs and cooling applications, with the balance shifting as the season progressed and temperatures increased. Architectural adaptations for Shemu were extensive. House openings facing the west, the direction of the harshest afternoon sun, might be completely sealed during this season, with alternative entrances and air circulation paths used instead. Roof coverings were adjusted to provide maximum shade while still allowing hot air to escape. Some families constructed seasonal shade structures in courtyards, using reed mats or fabric canopies that could be removed once Shemu ended, allowing more sunlight during the cooler seasons when it was welcome. Clothing during Shemu became minimal but strategic. Rather than simply wearing as little as possible, which would expose skin to direct sunlight, Egyptians opted for loose, lightweight garments that created shade for the body while allowing maximum air circulation. Head coverings became larger and more elaborate, protecting not just the head, but also the neck and upper back from direct sun exposure. Some specialized Shemu garments incorporated small weights along the hems to prevent them from clinging to the body, maintaining the crucial air gap that enabled continuous cooling. Daily schedules underwent their most dramatic seasonal shift during Shemu. Workdays often started well before dawn and ended by mid-morning, with activity resuming only after sunset. The midday rest period expanded to its greatest extent, with many Egyptians essentially inverting their most active hours to avoid the punishing midday heat. Even construction projects on royal tombs and monuments adjusted their schedules, with evidence suggesting that workers on the pyramids operated primarily during early morning, evening, and even night hours during the peak of Shemu. Food choices shifted dramatically during this season as well. Dishes were selected for their cooling properties, with cucumber, melon, and other high-moisture foods becoming dietary staples. Cooking was minimized, with many meals consisting of room temperature or cool items that required no heat preparation. Spices believed to have cooling effects, such as mint and coriander, were used abundantly, while those thought to have heating properties were avoided until the arrival of cooler seasons. Garden management during Shemu focused almost exclusively on cooling rather than aesthetics or food production. Plants were selected and positioned primarily for their shade and transpiration qualities, with flowering species that required less water given preference over more decorative but thirsty varieties. Irrigation became a precise science, with water applied in exactly the amounts needed to maintain transpiration without waste, often delivered below the soil surface to minimize evaporative loss before the plants could benefit. Sleeping arrangements reached their most elaborate during peak Shemu. Rooftop sleeping became the norm, with specialized bedding designed to maximize cooling while providing protection from occasional nighttime insect activity. Some families created seasonal sleep structures used only during the most extreme weeks, lightweight frames supporting thin fabric canopies that allowed air circulation while blocking dew formation and providing privacy. These temporary bedroom spaces were carefully positioned to catch whatever breeze might stir during the still desert nights. The transition periods between seasons required their own adaptive strategies. As one season shifted to another, Egyptians would gradually adjust their cooling techniques, neither abandoning the methods of the departing season too quickly, nor implementing those of the approaching season too soon. This measured approach allowed them to respond to the gradual temperature changes without being caught unprepared by unexpected weather patterns, an early heat spike during late Pered, for instance, or an unusually cool period during early Shemu. As you experience these seasonal shifts in ancient Egypt, you appreciate how the civilization's cooling strategies represented not just a collection of techniques, but a comprehensive seasonal choreography, with each element adjusted precisely as the year progressed. This adaptive approach allowed Egyptians to maintain reasonable comfort throughout the year despite dramatic climate variations and without any form of mechanical cooling assistance. The techniques for managing heat weren't distributed equally across ancient Egyptian society. As you observe cooling practices from the humblest farmer to the divine pharaoh, you notice how social class determined not just the quality and quantity of cooling methods available, but often entirely different approaches to the same basic challenge of staying comfortable in the desert heat. At the base of the social pyramid, peasant farmers had the fewest resources but developed remarkably effective cooling strategies suited to their circumstances. Their homes were simple but thermally efficient, typically built of mud brick with few openings to minimize heat penetration. What might appear primitive to modern eyes was actually a sophisticated passive cooling system. The thick walls absorbed heat slowly during the day, keeping interiors relatively cool, then released that stored heat at night when temperatures dropped. You might be surprised to find that the interior of a humble farmer's dwelling at midday could be significantly cooler than an elite stone mansion without its elaborate cooling systems activated. When working in the fields under the direct sun, farmers employed ingenious portable cooling techniques. Many wore simple head coverings made from reeds or palm fronds that provided shade while allowing heat to escape through the top. These weren't just hats, but miniature portable shade structures, often extending down to protect the neck and shoulders as well. Some farm workers fashioned crude evaporative cooling systems from pottery shards filled with water and hung from their belts, the slow seepage through the porous material, creating a small zone of cooling around their bodies as they worked. Water access was more limited for the lower classes, but they maximized the cooling potential of what they had. A seemingly simple water jar in a peasant home wasn't just a container, but a multifunction cooling device. Typically made of porous clay that allowed slight seepage, these vessels cooled their contents through evaporation, while also adding minimal humidity to the surrounding air. The jars would be positioned strategically near sleeping areas at night, or workspaces during the day, to provide maximum benefit from both the cooled water and the local evaporative effect. Farmers also practiced a form of cooperative cooling during intensive field work. Groups would take turns working in short bursts, with others resting in whatever shade was available. This rotation system prevented any individual from experiencing extended heat exposure and allowed workers to periodically lower their core body temperature before returning to exertion. Similar cooperative approaches extended to water collection, with communities often sharing the labor of drawing and transporting water from canals or the Nile, ensuring that even the poorest households had access to this essential cooling resource. For the urban working-class artisans, construction workers, and market vendor cooling strategies necessarily accommodated their need to remain productive despite the heat. Workshops were carefully designed with heat management as a primary consideration. Pottery workshops, for instance, typically separated the high-heat kiln areas from the forming and decorating spaces, with the latter positioned to catch prevailing breezes. Metalworking shops often operated primarily at night, when ambient temperatures made the necessary fires more tolerable. Construction sites featured temporary shade structures that moved as work progressed, ensuring workers always had some relief from direct sun. Market vendors developed particularly clever cooling systems for their merchandise. Those selling perishable goods like fish or meat created displays over shallow pools of water, using evaporative cooling to extend the life of their products, while also creating a cooler microclimate around their stalls that attracted heat-weary customers. Fabric sellers might sprinkle their wares with water periodically, simultaneously settling dust, releasing pleasant aromas from the dyes, and creating an inviting cool zone around their merchandise. Food vendors position their stalls to catch crosswinds, both for comfort and to waft enticing aromas toward potential customers. The middle class's minor officials, priests of lower rank, successful merchants occupied an interesting middle ground in cooling technology. While lacking the resources for the most elaborate systems enjoyed by the elite, they had sufficient means to implement more sophisticated approaches than the working classes. Their homes typically featured small but effective inner courtyards that created cooling air circulation, often with a modest pool or at least a water jar at the center. These middle-class homes might include a dedicated roof sleeping area with low walls for privacy while allowing maximum air circulation during hot nights. Middle-class cooling furniture represented a significant step up from peasant options. Rather than sleeping on simple reed mats on the floor, middle-class Egyptians typically had raised wooden bed frames with woven reed surfaces that allowed air circulation around the body. Their seating often incorporated similar ventilation features, chairs with openwork backs and seats that prevented the heat buildup associated with solid materials. These weren't just status symbols, but functional cooling technologies that significantly improved comfort. Clothing for the middle classes balanced status requirements with practical cooling needs. While they would have more garments than the working classes, allowing for frequent changes when perspiration soaked a particular item, their clothing still prioritized cooling function over elaborate decoration. The middle classes were particularly associated with the use of cooling accessories like small handheld fans and linen shawls that could be dampened for additional evaporative cooling effect when needed, without the commitment to a complete outfit change. The elite classicii officials, top priests, royal family members, and wealthy merchants enjoyed the most sophisticated and resource-intensive cooling systems. Their homes often featured dedicated seasonal wings, with different rooms used during different times of year based on their orientation and cooling properties. Elite dwellings typically included extensive gardens, not just for beauty, but as active components of a cooling system that could lower local temperatures through shade and transpiration. Some wealthy homes even incorporated water features specifically designed to cool passing breezes before they entered the living spaces. For the elite, human power amplified cooling technology considerably. Servants operated large fans continuously in occupied rooms, creating artificial breezes on even the stillest days. Other attendants might be assigned to periodically dampen floor coverings or wall hangings, maintaining continuous evaporative cooling throughout elite spaces. The wealthiest households maintained dedicated water carriers whose sole job was to ensure cooling water supplies remained fresh and abundant, with some large households consuming hundreds of gallons daily just for cooling purposes during the hottest periods. Elite cooling furniture reached remarkable levels of sophistication. Some chairs incorporated built-in fans, wooden frames with attached ostrich feathers that would generate a cooling breeze with the slightest movement of the sitter. Beds might feature frames for suspending cooling canopies, some designed to be dampened with scented water before sleep, creating a pleasant cooling microclimate around the sleeper all night. Even dining furniture incorporated cooling technology, with some elite tables featuring hollow, water-filled sections that kept serving dishes cool during lengthy meals. The clothing available to elites offered cooling advantages unavailable to other classes. They alone had access to the finest royal linen fabric, so sheer it was nearly transparent, with thread counts that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. These ultra-lightweight textiles maximized the cooling effect of even the slightest air movement while providing the coverage required by modesty and fashion. Elite garments often incorporated multiple layers of this fine fabric, creating insulating air spaces that could actually keep the wearer cooler than fewer layers would in direct sunlight. At the top of the social pyramid, the pharaoh enjoyed cooling technologies that bordered on the miraculous for their time. The royal palaces featured dedicated cooling rooms with thick walls, high ceilings, and sophisticated ventilation systems that maintained comfortable temperatures even during the most extreme heat. Some evidence suggests that certain pharaonic apartments included early versions of air shafts that functioned similarly to modern passive cooling towers, drawing hot air upward and out of living spaces, while pulling cooler air in from shaded garden areas. The Divine King also benefited from cooling symbols that reinforced his spiritual power while providing practical temperature relief. The ceremonial beard worn by pharaohs, while primarily symbolic, also protected the vulnerable neck from sun exposure. The crook and flail carried during ceremonies weren't just symbols of authority, but could be used as personal fans when needed. Even the famous blue crown, or hipresh, likely incorporated cooling technology, with some historians suggesting it may have been constructed with an inner layer that could be dampened before wear, providing evaporative cooling for the royal head. Historians still argue about whether some of the most extravagant cooling techniques described in ancient texts were technological realities or simply poetic exaggerations meant to emphasize the pharaoh's divine power over natural elements. Stories of rooms cooled by ice brought from distant mountains, or of magical fans that produced cooling breezes without human operation, might be purely mythical. They might represent actual luxury technologies available only to the god king, lost to time except in textual references. What remains clear from both archaeological and textual evidence is that cooling technology served as both a practical necessity and a powerful status marker in ancient Egyptian society. The more elaborate one's cooling systems, the higher one's social standing, yet even the humblest farmer had access to basic temperature management techniques that made desert life not just survivable, but reasonably comfortable. The ingenuity displayed at every social level demonstrates how central climate management was to this remarkable civilization that flourished in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The cooling methods of ancient Egypt may seem distant and primitive from our air-conditioned perspective, but they contain wisdom increasingly relevant to our modern world. As you reflect on these ancient techniques, you begin to see connections between these time-tested approaches and contemporary challenges in sustainable design and climate adaptation. The ancient Egyptians weren't just surviving in their harsh climate, they were developing solutions that remain instructive thousands of years later. Many of the passive cooling principles developed by ancient Egyptians are being rediscovered by today's green architects. The thermal mass concept, using thick walls to absorb heat during the day and release it at night, thus become a cornerstone of passive solar design. Modern buildings incorporating this ancient wisdom use materials like concrete, adobe, or water-filled containers as thermal batteries, regulating temperature without mechanical assistance. The next time you visit a contemporary building that maintains comfortable temperatures with minimal energy input, you're experiencing a direct descendant of Egyptian cooling technology. The Malkoff, or wind catcher, has experienced a particularly successful modern revival. These passive ventilation towers, which capture passing breezes and channel them into building interiors, are now being incorporated into eco-friendly architecture worldwide. Modern versions have been enhanced with contemporary materials and computational fluid dynamics modeling, but the basic principle remains unchanged from ancient Egypt. In hot, arid regions from the American Southwest to the Middle East, you can see these distinctive towers rising above sustainable buildings, harvesting the wind just as their ancient counterparts did thousands of years ago. Courtyard design represents another Egyptian cooling strategy enjoying renewed appreciation. The central courtyard that created natural convection currents in ancient homes has become a key feature in contemporary sustainable architecture. Modern variants might include retractable shading devices or misting systems, but they follow the same principles of creating protected microclimates and facilitating natural air movement. Some cutting-edge office buildings now incorporate multi-story interior atria that function essentially as vertical courtyards, using the same convection principles to move air through the structure without mechanical assistance. Evaporative cooling, perhaps the most essential Egyptian temperature management technique, has found numerous modern applications. Simple direct evaporative coolers, often called swamp coolers, use the same physical principle as ancient Egyptian water jars to cool buildings in dry climates at a fraction of the energy cost of conventional air. Conditioning. More sophisticated indirect evaporative systems overcome the humidity limitations of traditional approaches, expanding the geographical range where this ancient cooling method can be effectively employed. Even the cooling towers of large commercial buildings operate on principles that would be familiar to ancient Egyptian engineers. The Egyptian practice of seasonal adaptation, changing living patterns throughout the year to work with rather than against the climate, offers particularly valuable lessons for our energy-intensive society. Modern buildings are increasingly designed with seasonal flexibility, incorporating features like adjustable shading, changeable ventilation paths, and spaces that can be reconfigured based on the time of year. Some forward-thinking businesses have even reintroduced seasonal work schedules in hot climates, starting earlier and incorporating midday breaks during summer months, a direct revival of ancient Egyptian wisdom about working with natural rhythms rather than fighting them. Water features are regaining prominence in sustainable urban design, serving the same dual purpose they did in ancient Egypt: aesthetic enhancement and local climate modification. From the simple splash pads, increasingly common in urban plazas, to more elaborate canal systems and planned eco-communities, these water elements create cooling microclimates in public spaces while providing psychological relief from heat stress. The next time you feel the temperature drop as you approach an urban fountain, you're experiencing exactly the same cooling effect that refreshed ancient Egyptians along the Nile. The Egyptian understanding of appropriate clothing for hot climates offers lessons for both personal comfort and energy conservation. Modern technical fabrics designed for hot weather often recreate principles found in ancient Egyptian garments: lightweight, loose-fitting, with strategic ventilation. Some contemporary desert communities are rediscovering the wisdom of traditional loose-fitting garments that create a microclimate around the body rather than exposing skin directly to the sun. Even the growing popularity of siesta-like rest periods during the hottest parts of summer days in some European and American cities reflects Egyptian understanding of adapting human activity to environmental conditions. Perhaps most relevant to our contemporary challenges is the Egyptian approach to cooling as an integrated system rather than a technological quick fix. Their cooling strategies worked because they were comprehensive: architecture, clothing, schedules, plant selection, and water management all working together to create livable conditions. This holistic perspective is increasingly recognized as essential for sustainable design, with the most successful green buildings integrating multiple passive approaches rather than relying on a single technology or feature. The ancient Egyptian cooling system wasn't a device, but a way of life, a lesson particularly valuable as we confront the limitations of our energy-intensive cooling methods. The water management wisdom of ancient Egyptians has direct applications to contemporary water conservation efforts. Their techniques for maximizing the cooling benefit of limited water resources, using the same water for multiple cooling purposes, carefully timing irrigation to coincide with peak heat, selecting plants for maximum cooling effect per unit of water, offer valuable models for regions facing increasing water scarcity due to climate change. Some modern desert communities are reviving Egyptian-style greywater systems that use household water multiple times before it's eventually used for plant irrigation, extracting maximum benefit from this precious resource. Even the Egyptian use of gardens as active cooling elements rather than merely decorative features is finding new expression in contemporary green infrastructure. Modern concepts like cooling corridors, connected green spaces that create ventilation paths through urban areas build directly on Egyptian understanding of vegetation's climate modification properties. Vertical gardens and green roofs on contemporary buildings serve the same transpiration cooling function as plants in ancient Egyptian courtyards, though now often supported by sophisticated irrigation and monitoring systems unimaginable to their ancient counterparts. For individual buildings, the Egyptian practice of orientation-specific design, creating different building features based on which direction they face, has become a fundamental principle of sustainable architecture. Modern passive buildings carefully orient windows, thermal mass, and shading devices based on their relationship to the sun's path. Just as Egyptians aligned their structures to minimize western exposure and maximize northern ventilation, advanced modeling software now optimizes these relationships with mathematical precision, but the underlying principles would be immediately recognizable to an ancient Egyptian architect. The Egyptian understanding of cooling as a whole-body experience involving all senses has influenced contemporary approaches to thermal comfort. Modern research confirms what Egyptians knew intuitively, that psychological factors significantly impact perceived temperature. Their use of cooling sounds, like trickling water, cooling scents, like mint, and visual cooling cues, like blue-painted ceilings, finds parallels in contemporary multisensory design approaches that can improve comfort perceptions without changing actual air temperature. Some innovative companies are now exploring how these non-thermal comfort factors can reduce energy consumption while maintaining occupant satisfaction. Most profound is the Egyptian lesson about adapting to local conditions rather than imposing a standardized approach regardless of climate. Their cooling techniques were specifically developed for their particular environment, methods optimized for the hot, dry conditions of their region. This contrasts sharply with our modern tendency to use similar mechanical cooling systems worldwide, regardless of local climate conditions. As energy costs and climate impacts become increasing concerns, this Egyptian wisdom about climate-specific solutions offers a valuable model for developing regionally appropriate sustainable technologies. As societies worldwide face the dual challenges of climate change and energy constraints, the passive cooling wisdom of ancient Egypt becomes increasingly relevant. These weren't primitive stopgaps used until real technology could be developed. They were sophisticated, refined systems that worked within environmental limitations rather than trying to overcome them through brute force energy expenditure. In a world reconsidering the wisdom of our energy-intensive approaches to climate control, these ancient techniques offer not just historical curiosity, but practical inspiration for a more sustainable future. As night falls over the ancient landscape, the cooling technologies you've experienced throughout this journey continue their quiet work. The thick walls that absorb the day's heat now radiate gentle warmth into the night air. The garden plants settle into darkness, their transpiration slowing as they prepare for the coming dawn. The water features still release the last of their cooling moisture into the evening breeze. You find yourself lying on a simple reed mat spread across a rooftop, the day's heat gradually dissipating into the vast desert sky above. Stars emerge with a clarity only possible in this dry air, creating a glittering canopy that seems close enough to touch. The temperature drops steadily, almost rapidly, as it always does in desert environments once the sun retreats. Around you, other families have also claimed their roof spaces for the night, creating a community of sleepers under the stars. Soft conversations drift across the darkened rooftops, gradually fading as sleep claims one person after another. No mechanical hums disturb the peace, just the occasional distant barking of dogs or braying of donkeys. As your consciousness begins to drift towards sleep, you realize that the ancient Egyptians found something we often miss in our temperature-controlled modern environments, a connection to the natural rhythms of heating and cooling. An acceptance of temperature as a dynamic experience rather than a static number to be maintained regardless of cost. Their cooling wisdom wasn't just about physical comfort, but about finding harmony with environmental conditions that couldn't be escaped, only accommodated. The gentle weight of a light linen sheet settles over you, providing just enough protection from the cooler night air without blocking the refreshing breeze. Your body, which adapted throughout the day to the desert conditions, now welcomes the cool relief of evening, appreciating it all the more for the heat that preceded it. And in this peaceful moment between wakefulness and dreams, you understand that perhaps the most important lesson from ancient Egyptian cooling wisdom isn't about technology at all, but about perspective, approaching environmental challenges with ingenuity, adaptation, and a willingness to work with, rather than against, the natural world.